Damien O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Mr Chairman, I'll go to clause 228A. It's the issue of exemptions. And having not been on the committee, I haven't been privy to the discussion around this, but I'm trying to think of where exemptions might occur. And we have reference to the armed forces earlier in the legislation, the body of the legislation. And there are some criteria, of course, and the regulator may exempt any person. And just to go back, it's exemption from compliance with regulations. So the regulations will be imposed, but it will allow an exemption from compliance with that. And I've been trying to think through situations where that might occur, because it says in 228A2B, the exemption is not inconsistent, so it must not be granted if the exemption is not inconsistent with the purpose of in this Act. Sorry, that is that the exemption may be granted, but the purpose of the Act must still be complied with. And while I have raised the issue earlier in the debate around the balanced framework rather than an effective framework, which I would have always advocated for, Mr Speaker, the requirements and the purposes cover a fairly wide range of things. And so fair and effective workplace representation, encouraging unions and employer organisations to take a constructive role. The question I ask of the Minister is that for what purpose would we have an exemption? And it's not a flippant question, it is one that I'm struggling to understand, because the purposes of the Act are sound, and while I may take issue with words, I think we know what we are trying to achieve here, and to allow exemptions from compliance is somewhat of a dangerous thing. In the armed forces, I think there is some understanding. I have been an adventure tourism operator, I have been a farmer. I still can't think of areas where I would wish, these are both, in my view, high-risk areas, in spite of the view of the government, where I would want us to deviate from the objectives and the purposes of this piece of legislation. And keeping that in mind, I would have thought we were covered and didn't need an exemption. Now, I'm looking out, there may be in nature, of course, unforeseen circumstances, but you can't regulate, in my view, or for exemptions. Or maybe this is the area that the Minister wants to refer to. If there is a natural event, and if it hasn't been possible to comply with the regulations, maybe then that stops prosecution from occurring, or an inspector from coming in and initiating that. But I would think and hope, and it's the loophole I guess they used in Pike River, that in unforeseen circumstances there is a plan B or a plan C or a plan D, because we shouldn't undertake anything that would put anyone's life at risk. We are trying to protect employees and employers and anyone, of course, in and around the workplace. So I asked the question of the Minister, and hopefully she can come back and answer that. Mr Speaker, there are other provisions in here, and one of the things I wanted to look at is the one of notification, and a very important part where I guess notification does notifiable events, I think is the right term from it in regulations here, prescribing matters including requirements relating to notifiable events at workplaces, including regulating the taking of any action to prevent a notifiable event. The question I have is ensuring that every employer understands what a notifiable event is, and will those events be written down in regulation, or will they just in general principle be covered? Because it is at the cutting edge, I guess, of implementation, of prosecution, and of the fear that some employers have. A notifiable event in one workplace, I guess cutting your finger in an office might be seen as a major event in defence of the farmers. If you cut your finger while you're fencing, then it's probably not a notifiable event. And I'm just assuming that the regulations cover that. I have to say, Mr Chairman, that I would have hoped that we, Mr Chairman.
Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Thank you. I would have hoped that the regulations would have allowed that kind of variation, say take a cut finger, across a number of occupations, and it would have been better to do that than to say that some occupations simply were low risk and cover it in that way. I think the approach that the government has used in this area has been absolutely wrong. And there'll be people here interested in the farming sector, and they may think they have gained a huge victory in this. And I could go back, Mr Speaker, and indeed I have gone back to the 1992 legislation and the debates in the House here, where the ministers, the National Party ministers, said that they had made great headway in achieving a balanced piece of health and safety legislation, that it had done away, of course, with mining legislation, or assumed a code of practice might have come in. So people, probably the farmers and others, saw it as a huge victory, but I haven't counted up the number of people who have been killed, and I'm not naive enough to think that every one of those deaths would have been prevented. But if we had taken an approach as many other countries had done, not the one of the 1992 government, and now the one of the 2015 government, both of which are national, that says balanced approach is necessary. Well, when it comes to people's lives, we need better than balance. We need effective legislation that ensures that any young or old person that goes out on a farm or into a forest or in an office workplace is going to be safe, Mr Speaker. And you don't have to go very far to, in terms of Google, to pick up example after example of death and failure of our systems on farms to protect workers. And a continuation of the same is not good enough. In fact, when seatbelts were introduced into this country, there were many people who said, look, we can't enforce this on people. We can't ensure that everyone in a car wears a seatbelt. We've got to be reasonable about this. Well, no, the law said we had to. And now we've got to a point in our culture and our approach to car safety has improved to the point where young children will scream if they're not in a seatbelt. And that's a great outcome. And there will be a point in the future on farms where the culture and the approach to safety is one that does generate a far better outcome. I'm concerned that the compromises to achieve the so-called balance and to look at maybe notifiable events in a slightly different way between farms and other workplaces, indeed between different types of farming. A worm farm being a high-risk venture and a dairy farm being a low-risk one, Mr Speaker. The ridiculousness, the stupidity of that is not lost on just about every single New Zealander. Mr Speaker, I come back to the one of exemptions because the government has made an exemption for a whole class of and classes of farming, which is stupid. And I'm fearing that the exemptions that are wide open through legislation in clause 228A here may allow the government, because of political lobbying or anything else, to leave open other exemptions that may not protect workers in this country. Mr Speaker, we don't want some kind of ridiculous authoritarian regime. We do want to improve the culture, but it is absolutely essential that we take a fair approach to all employers throughout New Zealand. All employers take on board their responsibility, as do all employees. But to leave out, as the government has done, some key areas where it's obvious every day in the paper. I'm sure every single day in rural and provincial New Zealand we would have at least a report of an injury, and all too often, unfortunately, a report of a death. To make those exemptions makes a mockery of what this Parliament is trying to do, Mr Speaker, and I hope that this clause here, allowing exemptions, is not abused by the same stupidity of a government or a regulator or anyone to not protect New Zealanders.
Mr. Chairman, I'm really pleased to contribute.